Now we turn to the second paper, and I invite Dr. Ronjon Paul Datta to present. The title of the paper is Zombie Capitalism and Sovereignty between Bataille and Agamben. Thank you. Please take it away.
Okay, I think the subtitle for my paper might well be Tales from the Cryptic Theorist, but we'll see how it goes. This paper is part of a broader project on the socio-political forms of modernity and post-modernity. Crucial for me are the predominant normative coordinates that involve a concern with the future, a future that is lived on the terrain of human material historical existence, and not a supernatural one tied to a religious notion of the afterlife or eternity. For Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, for instance, Machiavelli encapsulated this new humanism early on. Fates can be made, they are not predetermined, neither are they the result of divine caprice, provided there is a lasting encounter between virtue and fortune, in which the multitude, even a multitude of zombies, is the decisive force. To live in political modernity, for me, especially one in which finance and security are valorized, is to live in a present governed and dominated by the future. To be governed by the future means a constant valuing of consequences and means for figuring out what they might be, precisely in the human domain of contingency and the arbitrary nature of social institutions. Things can always be made otherwise. Indeed, for me, this is one of the striking features of the past quarter century. Expecting people to have appropriate expectations. For economists, expectations are everything, but expectations about a future one cannot predict. People are supposed to be responsible for their choices. Alas, what if it doesn't work out? In the Great Recession, it didn't, and yet these same coordinates prevail, hence the development of zombie economics, as John Quiggin has put it. But while I have a certain scholastic interest in these broader issues, I'm more specifically concerned with examining the political economy of debt in light of the sociology of morals. Some of this is fairly self-evident. As a debtor, one signs a promise to pay. One is ensconced in a contractual relation, obliging you to pay and doing so in the future. Such promises, in binding us to a future, are inherently moral, as Nietzsche pointed out. Debt obligations structure futures through means of moral domination. Enter the socio-economic zombie. A socio-economic zombie is insolvent and is not likely to ever return to solvency, should be dead, and yet is still alive and kicking and groaning because of various means and schemes for refinancing debt, government infusions, and criminal activity. As far as capital is concerned, this is unjust and immoral. Indeed, for many on both the left and the right, ringing the alarm bells about government or sovereign debt, household debt, student debt, ostensibly, we're living in the zombie apocalypse. The apocalypse, translated from the Koine or common Greek of the New Testament, is a revelation. The Great Recession revealed a world breeding socioeconomic zombies. The basics of my argument are as follows. The massive explosion in consumer debt, mortgage debt, student debt, etc. is not simply a product of mindless consumerism. Neither is it reducible to the use of debt to cover shortfalls between household incomes and expenses, for example, paying for credential inflation. Rather, I see in excess consumption something of a desire to be sovereign in Georges Bataille's sense, one who can decide when the rules don't apply and fully accepts and endures the consequences even when tragic. It means not having to be a puritanical cyborg, the purely and constantly instrumentally rational calculating social actor, a fleshy bit of accounting software, a slave to calculation. Think instead of charging a few $1,000s for a ticket to a World Series game, or for a tragically hip concert on their final tour, or doubling down yet again at the casino, or, heck, let's have another round, getting a taste for the moment that I can live without a care. This is the eternal return of the present, and hence meaning that one has, for a moment, thrown subordination to a previously accepted goal or plan out the window. It is the thrill of going down a different path, being surprised and being open to being surprised. But this possibility of getting a taste of sovereignty was fueled by taking on debt. Consequently, this sovereign very quickly encounters another sovereign, the sovereign that applies the law, enforces the law, and can suspend the law, crucially so over life itself. This is the sovereign as theorized by Giorgio Agamben, the Italian political philosopher. In the socio-economic realm, this sovereign decides on creditworthiness. No credit, no life. Thus, we have the confrontation between one sovereign rejecting the imposition of instrumental rationality on one hand, and on the other, the sovereignty of capital, that has the power to constitute the socio-economic zombie. These are two models of sovereignty, both of which provide different and competing ways of thinking about life and death in the contemporary political and highly politicized economy. Zombies are a descriptor of a certain class of economic agents, likely unprofitable ones who continue to function economically on the basis of perpetual borrowing and ever-inventive financing and refinancing arrangements. As one commentator puts it, zombies suck the life out of an economy by consuming tax money, capital, and labor that would be better deployed in growing companies and sectors. Meanwhile, by slashing prices to generate sales, zombie companies can drag healthier rivals into insolvency. The US today has its zombie banks. Zombie banks dead but still walking among the living are, and here I'm quoting Stiglitz, in Ed Kane's Immortal Worlds, gambling on resurrection. Repeating the savings and loan debacle of the 1980s, the banks are using bad accounting. They were allowed, for example, to keep impaired assets on their books without writing them down, on the fiction that they might be held to maturity and somehow turn healthy, end quote. For Bataille, Homo economicus is not the little rational sovereign. Rather, it is useless consumption, consumption of excesses and excess consumption that encapsulates what is distinctive about being human. Grand temples and palaces, wars, art, religion, luxury, the great things and legacies of civilization, one could say today the Olympics too, tell us more about humanity than can the image of the instrumentally rational social actor. This economy of excess and useless consumption is what he calls the general economy instead of the restricted economy of instrumental rationality. It is hard to avoid arguing that consumerism lost touch with the reality principle of delayed gratification to become a squanderous indulgence. It became the driving force of the North American economy in the wake of the Vietnam War. Furthermore, workers in this period came to define themselves above all as consumers who willingly suffer the disutility of labor to acquire the utilities embodied in consumption. What workers produce in debt-fueled consumption are, though, their credit ratings. All of this means concretely is that finance, capital banks on the belief that people will primarily work more to gain income in whatever way to continue to meet their debt obligations and gain access to credit. But there is a kind of freedom in reckless consumerism inasmuch as it involves an attempt to suspend consequences of a future. In this regard, I rethink Bataille's notion of sovereignty in terms of what I call reflexive sovereignty. By this, I mean that people consume without a care in order to appear sovereign, which is to say, appear unconstrained by the mere and dehumanizing effects of instrumental reason. In doing so, they reflexively increase the appearance to others that, as social beings, they are worth the risk of socializing with. It goes something like this. Look at me, I consume without a thought for the future because I don't need to. Excessive consumption is less about displaying cultural capital and the markings of high social status. Rather, it is about signifying sovereignty and freedom from strict instrumental rationality. Indeed, the worst thing one can signify is that one is exactly a purely instrumentalist miser, or purely instrumentalist out of necessity, that is, not good enough to just do more than get by. For Giorgio Agamben, sovereignty is that which decides on the life that's worth living or the life that's worth valuing and what can be included and excluded from social and political life. For him, the key figure in understanding how political sovereignty has shaped the fate of Western civilization lies in the ancient Roman figure of Homo sacer. Homo sacer is the person that has been stripped of political and religious rights, and hence can be killed without it being called homicide, and whose life doesn't count for a religious meaning either, and hence it doesn't count as a sacrifice. The difficulty with Agamben is that he's got too broad a conception of what counts as life. In political modernity, what counts as life is typically socio-economic life. That's the target of government and development. So if we transpose Agamben's too broad conception of sovereignty to the socio-economic terrain of political modernity, what we see is that capital has itself become sovereign, deciding on the life and death of socio-economic agents through things like credit rating or bond rating. You can value one household or person's life as being worth a credit risk, or indeed an entire country and a way of life, as we saw with the denigration of Greece. But it's being then subjected to this kind of sovereign that's always deciding on your creditworthiness as a way to continue to finance one's life and one's belonging to society. So we have this struggle I see between two kinds of sovereignty. One spelled out by Bataille, where you consume without a care because that's precisely what makes us human, that connects us to people in profound, surprising ways, even when we know that spending extravagantly may hurt us. So what might this mean for surviving the zombie apocalypse? I think here neither Bataille nor Agamben provide us with the tools for thinking it through, and instead I think we need to return to a third sovereign, that of the popular sovereign. Zombie myths are zombie myths about an inarticulate, consuming, barely distinguishable horde with the massive power of sheer numbers just doing what they're doing points to this power of the popular sovereign. We find such indications and representations of the monstrosity of mobs, of uprisings of the urban proletariat, but also in the uncoordinated power of the market, people making a multitude of purchasing decisions, deciding on the fate of firms, or, as Antonio Negri puts it, we can deal in the creative power of the multitude, a collective power to create that is always a step or two ahead of those who would appropriate the value produced. So how might this popular sovereign respond to the zombie apocalypse of a world breeding socio-economic zombies indebted to the power of the sovereignty of capital? One, the popular sovereign has already shown some way for surviving, but it's not the figure of a triumphant zombie, it's more Marx's model, one Bataille appropriated as well, of the old mole. So things like minimizing overall total social reproduction costs. Things like, and I think we've seen this play out over the past 25 years, I think, really, since the 90-91 recession. One, not having children. Two, living at home with one's parents for a fairly prolonged period of time. Delaying retirement, working in retirement. Downsizing housing, so preferring condos to houses. And with doing that, you can buy your $1,500 bicycle with disc brakes. You can spend on the $6 lattes because it's still way cheaper than buying a car. You get things like aspiration deflation. So one symptom of that I see is the fascination with tiny houses, right? You just make your expectations small or less, and then you can be fine with that. Or things like raising a child in a downtown apartment isn't that bad. Or working part-time and studying part-time, a pay-as-you-go model. All of these ways of of mitigating against debt. A second way I see of surviving the zombie apocalypse, one I think is pretty remote, is a revitalization of political culture and revalorizing of society. But I think if the US election is any indication, we're not seeing the valorization of politics anytime soon. Rather, we're seeing its denigration. But I still think there are some things that could be done on that front. Things like big ones, certainly in the Canadian context, fostering rental housing development, thus mitigating against mortgage debt, even if asset-backed in the case of housing, while reducing transaction costs associated with moving and a mobile workforce. Two, drastically reducing post-secondary tuition or simply making it free. After all, I think it makes little sense to saddle young adults with costs of decisions about program choice and career paths given the vicissitudes of labor markets. As I'm fond of saying, I defy any economist to tell you what a labor market's going to look like 10 years hence, yet we're telling 13-year-old pimply-faced students and their parents to decide what their career paths are going to be. So saddling with the consequences of things that they simply can't predict. That's a recipe for zombification. I think we should also take seriously some issue about recognizing that access to credit is a public utility and should be treated as such. Some way this might be done, tying a guaranteed basic income to access to a credit facility. So if you have a basic income of, say, $20,000 per, some of that could be sequestered off into access to credit in as much as you need credit to buy things on Amazon or rent a car, as the case may be. Third, taking seriously some notion of a jubilee, debt forgiveness, and popular sovereignty. Zombie capitalism depends on perpetual indebtedness in the absence of conditions for the satisfaction of obligations and expectations. It's a problem with social reproduction broadly understood. For example, this generation will have a worse standard of living than the previous one. I'd say Canada has had a zombie social formation for quite some time, going along with expectations from a bygone era, whether concerning targets for economic growth, population growth, investment rates, income growth, etc., and is aimed to provide means for securing such aspirations. That tells me my time's up, but I'm nearly done. Indebtedness, though, always depends on the offering of credit, and here a return to the Latin roots, credo, faith, is suggestive. For Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Abraham is the originary of faith. The story of God's covenant with Abram in Genesis 15 is one in which the sovereign, an alternative translation for shield and protector, takes it upon itself to complete the covenantal ritual binding on both parties, for both parties, thus sealing the covenant. The shift does not imply the lifting of obligations which remain, but it does indicate where the source of power to fulfill the obligation originates, namely God. This moral logic can be transposed to the register of a humanist variant of popular sovereignty. Myths, after all, for Bataille and sociologist Emile Durkheim, are a reflection of organizational forms and power relations in society. In myth, the powers of society are mistaken for the powers of God. There are indications that societies indeed have the power to meet debtors' obligations. Having a currency is one. Witness, for instance, the capacity we had for various kinds of quantitative easing. Bailouts for big banks indicate that this is possible, as does the massive scale of loan forgiveness and debt write-downs ameliorating third world debt crises. A country can also sell and own its own debt, and this isn't a bad thing. It provides means for economic sovereignty and societal security over the long haul. Debt forgiveness can be construed as a gift of the people to itself. It has the power to do so, and perhaps with this gesture, it can reach its peak power, expressing what is in the very nature of social life, namely constituting people with the capacity to think of the well-being of others, the highest expression of social life encapsulated in altruism, and its power to make and transform the life of others, manifested in mercy and forgiveness. The popular sovereign can suspend the application of the normal rules and sanctions, change the outcome, and life can go on. I'll conclude with that. Thank you very much.